In 1900, a doctor in Indianapolis named John Hardy started noticing something strange about the babies who were dying. They weren't starving. They weren't sick in any way he recognized. They were dying with milk in their stomachs, milk that hadn't spoiled, that stayed sweet for days without ice in the middle of an Indiana summer. And that was the problem. The reason it didn't spoil is that it had been dosed with formaldehyde, the same compound undertakers were pumping into corpses 2 blocks away. The dairymen called it preservaline. Hardy found a better word. He called it embalmed milk, and the newspapers never let it go. Here's the part that should unsettle you. When Hardy went looking for the law that made this illegal, there wasn't one. For the first 130 years of its existence, the United States had no Food and Drug Administration, no ingredient labels, no safety testing, no agency you could call. A manufacturer could put almost anything into almost anything, ship it across state lines, print any claim he liked on the bottle, and the federal government had no clear authority to stop him. And yet this was the same country laying transcontinental rail and raising steel-framed skyscrapers that had just fought a war across an ocean and won it in 10 weeks. It could move an army to the Philippines. It could not tell you what was in a glass of milk. So, 2 questions. First, how does a modern industrial nation go 130 years with nobody checking? And second, what actually changed in 1906, and why did it take a government chemist feeding poison to 12 volunteers in a Washington basement to make it happen? The answer runs through cowsheds built onto the side of distilleries, morphine syrup marketed to teething infants, a secret clause buried in newspaper advertising contracts, and a novel about a Chicago slaughterhouse that its own author spent his life calling a failure. And one correction first, because this story usually gets told wrong. This wasn't a gap or an oversight, it was a doctrine. A century of American legal thinking held that what a man put into his own product was his own affair. If it was fraud, you sued him. If it killed you, your family sued him. That was the whole remedy. Underneath it sat a phrase we now use as a joke, and which at the time was closer to an operating system. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. It worked in a village, where you bought milk from a man whose cows you could see. Then, in 50 years, America built railroads, refrigeration, canning, national brands, and cities of 1 million people. And the man who made your food became a stranger 1,000 miles away whose face you'd never see. The doctrine didn't change. The world did. And the FDA was never designed. Nobody sat down and built it. It was assembled out of scandal, in pieces over 60 years, and almost every piece was paid for in advance with bodies. To understand how bad it got, you have to go back to a cow standing in a distillery basement in Brooklyn. In the 1840s and 50s, American cities had a milk problem that was really a physics problem. Milk spoils in hours in the heat, refrigeration barely existed, and cities were growing faster than the countryside could deliver. If you wanted fresh milk in Manhattan, the cow had to be in Manhattan, which is expensive, unless you find something free to feed it. Distilleries had exactly that. Whiskey and beer production left behind enormous quantities of spent grain mash, hot, wet, and useless. So dairymen built cowsheds onto the sides of distilleries and ran the still steaming slop into the troughs. Free feed. Zero transport. A dairy inside the city it sold to. The cows did not do so well. Contemporary accounts describe rotting teeth, ulcerated sores, tails that fell off. Some grew too weak to stand and were held upright in slings, milked until they died on their feet. Their milk came out thin and faintly blue. That's the horror. But follow the fraud, because the fraud tells you how deep this went. Blue milk doesn't sell, so the swill dairies solved that. Chalk and plaster of Paris for whiteness, starch or flour for body, molasses or burnt sugar for a warm yellow tint, eggs for richness, and in the worst cases a little of the animal's own blood to hide the fact that the milk was already streaked with it. Sit with that. That's not laziness. That's a deliberate, chemically informed process refined and shared among competitors to make a product that will sicken a child look exactly like one that won't. In 1858, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper went after it. Artists sent into the sheds engravings of cows in slings week after week. Reformers claimed swill milk was killing 8,000 infants a year in New York City alone. That figure comes from campaigners, not from any modern study. But infant mortality was catastrophic. Milk was a major vector, and the people closest to it believed thousands were dying. New York banned adulterated milk in 1862. It was under-enforced and stopped at the state line. Federally, nothing. The scandal broke, filled the papers, horrified the country, and it was another 48 years before Congress passed a food safety law. Swill milk was a crude fraud, dirt and chalk. What came next was far more sophisticated and much harder to see, because at the same time, American chemistry was getting very good. Here's what was going into food by the 1880s and 90s. Hear it not as a policy problem but as an inventory. Borax in butter and ham, salicylic acid in ketchup, canned fruit and beer. Sulfites in ground meat to turn beef that had gone gray back to a fresh-looking red. Copper sulfate to make canned peas a brighter green. Alum in bread. Lead chromate for yellow, in mustard, in candy sold to children. Coal tar dyes poured into everything with almost no testing. And in milk, water, chalk, and formaldehyde. Now the easy story is that the food industry was full of villains, some of it was, but that story leaves you unable to understand why this was so hard to stop. Rail and canning had just created something that never existed before, a genuinely national food market where your dinner was 3 days and 1,000 miles from where it was made. Refrigeration was expensive and unreliable. Preservative chemistry was what made the whole thing possible. So the preservative was not in itself the crime. It was the innovation, what let a working family in Pittsburgh eat canned peaches in February. The crime was that nobody was checking the dose. No standard for how much borax was too much. No requirement to say it was in there. No agency that could walk into a plant and take a sample. No definition anywhere in federal law of what adulterated even meant. A manufacturer deciding how much salicylic acid went into a barrel of ketchup made that call alone, with a profit motive on one side of the scale and nothing at all on the other. And of all these compounds, one worked better than anything else. Cheap, nearly odorless at low concentrations, and it killed bacteria dead. Its industrial name was formalin. You know it as formaldehyde. Here's why it works and why it's specifically horrifying here. Formaldehyde cross-links proteins, locks them together so they can't break down. That's why an undertaker uses it, and that is exactly what it does in milk. But there's a second effect that matters more. It doesn't just keep milk from going bad, it masks milk that has already started to. It arrests the process and hides the evidence. A dairyman with a load that was turning didn't have to dump it. He dosed it and sold it. Sometimes he dosed the same load twice. It was sold openly, in bottles, under trade names, Preservaline, Freezine, Iceline, Shield brand. Look at those names. They're all selling the same thing. They're selling cold to people who can't afford ice. Which brings us back to Dr. John Newell Hurdy of the Indiana State Board of Health, a data obsessive with a real talent for publicity. Around 1899, his office started testing Indiana milk and found formaldehyde in casual, widespread use. He put two words together, embalmed milk, and handed the American press a phrase it could not resist. He also produced a number, roughly 400 child deaths in Indiana in a single year. That's an official's estimate, made mid-campaign, disputed then and unverifiable now. But you don't need the number to see the shape of the problem. An adult drinks a glass with a meal, diluted across 170 pounds and a stomach full of other food. An infant on the bottle drinks nothing else. Nothing. 6-8 times a day into 15 pounds of body weight. Whatever the true figure was, the exposure was concentrated onto the smallest people in the country. And in most of the United States in 1900, this was not a crime. No federal standard for milk, no federal definition of adulteration, no authority to test a sample, and no penalty if it failed. There was, however, exactly one man in the federal government who'd spent 17 years trying to change that. And he was about to do something no government scientist had ever done or would ever be permitted to do again. His name was Harvey Washington Wiley, farm boy from Indiana, Union Army veteran, medical degree, then Harvard for a science degree in a single year because he'd decided medicine wasn't quite it. First professor of chemistry at Purdue. In 1883, he became chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture and started testing the American food supply and publishing what he found, bulletin after bulletin. Borax in the butter, salicylic acid in the canned goods, coal tar dye in everything. Congress read it, nodded, and did nothing. Bill after bill was introduced. Bill after bill died. Because Wiley kept hitting the same wall. He could prove a chemical was present. He could not prove it was harmful. Industry's answer was always the same, and it wasn't a stupid one. Where's your body? People had been eating borax-preserved ham for 20 years. Where were the dead? Until you can show us, you're a chemist with a hobby and an opinion. He was right that they were wrong. He just had no way to demonstrate it. So in 1902, he got Congress to appropriate $5,000 for what the legislation delicately called hygienic table trials, and did the only thing he could think of. He decided to feed the poison to people and watch what happened. He recruited 12 young men, mostly clerks from within the department in their 20s, drawn largely by the offer of free meals. They signed waivers releasing the government from liability and agreed to eat nowhere else for months. It ran in the basement of the Bureau of Chemistry. Every man weighed before every meal, every portion of food weighed, and every bodily excretion collected and analyzed so Wiley could calculate how much of a compound went in, how much came back out, and therefore how much stayed. They ran it in cycles, a clean control period, then the substance at a low dose, then escalation until symptoms appeared. The squad worked through borax, salicylic acid, sulfites, benzoates, formaldehyde, copper sulfate, and saltpeter. The results: nausea, headaches, abdominal pain, and appetite loss so severe that men couldn't finish the meals they were required to eat. In the borax trials, some simply stopped being able to work. Volunteers dropped out. Replacements were brought in. And then a reporter for the Washington Post named George Rothwell Brown gave the whole thing a name: the Poison Squad. Wiley complained publicly. He also understood exactly what he'd been handed. Reporters staked out the building. Papers ran updates on how the men were holding up. Cartoonists drew skeletons at the dinner table. The volunteers produced a mock motto: "Only the brave dare eat the fare," and songs got written about them. This is the real mechanism, and the part I most want you to take away. Wiley did not win with data. He'd been publishing data for 19 years, and it changed nothing. He won because he accidentally invented a serial drama with a cast and ran it in the newspapers for 4 years. By the time the results were published, the argument was over. Now the other half, because skipping it would be dishonest. By any modern standard, the Poison Squad was ethically indefensible. 12 subjects, no blinding, no proper control. The subjects were employees of the man running the study. A coercion problem, however willing they were. And doses were escalated until people got sick, because getting sick was the endpoint, which is the irony at the center of this whole story. The experiments that helped create American consumer protection would be flatly illegal under the framework they created. But Wiley still had one problem that no amount of publicity could solve. The industry he was fighting owned the newspapers, not the food industry, the drug industry, specifically patent medicine. Patent medicine was one of the largest advertising categories in American publishing. Hundreds of brands, in every general store and by mail order to every farm in the country. The model had 3 legs. 1. The formula was secret. Despite the name, most weren't patented at all, because patenting meant disclosing the contents. 2. No requirement to list ingredients. 3. No restriction on what you could claim it cured, so they claimed everything. Cancer, tuberculosis, epilepsy, deafness, so what was in them? Alcohol, in enormous quantity. There were temperance tonics, sold to women in dry counties and to people who'd signed pledges, running higher proof than the whiskey they were abstaining from. Opium, morphine, cocaine after 1885, chloroform. None of it on the label, because there was no label. And the worst example connects straight back to where we started. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was sold for decades as a remedy for teething infants. The advertising was gentle and domestic. Calm mothers, sleeping babies, the promise of a quiet night. It contained morphine sulfate. Given to infants by mothers with no way of knowing, at doses nobody regulated, for a condition that resolves on its own. The American Medical Association eventually labeled it a baby killer. Sales continued. Now here's what explains why nothing got fixed for 30 years, and it's one of the most effective pieces of political engineering in American history. Patent medicine advertising contracts contained a clause. It became known as the Red Clause, and in substance it said, this contract is void if any law restricting patent medicines is enacted in the state where your newspaper is published. Follow the money because the consequence isn't obvious until you do. That clause meant every newspaper in America holding a patent medicine contract, nearly all of them, had a direct contractual interest in making sure their legislature never passed a drug law. One line of boilerplate converted the American press from a neutral party into a lobbying arm. So when you ask why the press didn't expose this for 30 years, that's why. They weren't asleep. They were on payroll. Then in October 1905, Collier's Weekly ran the first installment of an 11-part series by Samuel Hopkins Adams called The Great American Fraud. Adams named products, printed laboratory analyses, reprinted glowing testimonial letters alongside the death certificates of the people who wrote them. Colliers knew what it would cost them in advertising and ran it anyway. Adams cracked the wall. It took a failed socialist novelist, a Chicago stockyard, and a president reading over breakfast to bring it down. Everything landed in about 5 months in 1906. 3 separate forces, none of them coordinated, arriving at once. The first was legislative. A pure food bill had been introduced in Congress for 20 years and died every time, filibustered, buried in committee, amended into meaninglessness. In February 1906, on the back of the Poison Squad coverage and the Collier's series, it passed the Senate. Then it went to the House, where 20 years of precedent said it would quietly die again. The second was a novel. Upton Sinclair had spent about 7 weeks undercover in the Chicago packing district. He was a serious socialist, and his subject was labor, the immigrant families destroyed by the packing houses. The Jungle was published in February 1906 and became an immediate sensation, for entirely the wrong reason. What the reading public took from it wasn't the destruction of a Lithuanian immigrant family. It was what went into the sausage, the rats, the men who fell into rendering tanks, the diseased carcasses processed anyway, perhaps a dozen pages out of the whole book. Sinclair spent the rest of his life on this, and his line about it is one of the great summaries of authorial frustration in English. I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach. The third force was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not like Sinclair. He thought him a hysteric and a socialist crank, and he wasn't going to legislate off a novel. So he did something more useful than believing it. He sent his own men, Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and a lawyer named James Bronson Reynolds, to Chicago unannounced. The Packers heard they were coming and cleaned frantically. It didn't matter. Neal and Reynolds confirmed the conditions, and their report was harder to read than the novel because it wasn't fiction. Roosevelt understood he was holding a weapon rather than a document. He let the House know he had it, and that he was prepared to release all of it. Meat exports were already collapsing as European buyers canceled orders. The bill moved. On June 30, 1906, Roosevelt signed both the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act on the same day. And here's the footnote most tellings leave out. The large packers ultimately supported federal inspection, not out of shame, out of arithmetic. It was paid for by the taxpayer, it restored the export markets they just lost, and it imposed costs their smaller competitors couldn't absorb. The pattern is real, and you'll see it repeatedly in the century that follows. Regulation arriving as a punishment, settling in as a moat. So, victory. Roll credits. Except the 1906 Act was full of holes, and Wiley knew it within 18 months. It did not require anyone to prove a product was safe before selling it. A company could put a new compound on the market Monday, and the government's only recourse was to buy some, test it, and go to court after it was already in people's homes. The burden sat entirely on the government, case by case, with a few dozen inspectors for a continental economy. It did not ban addictive drugs. It required that habit-forming substances, alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, cannabis, be disclosed on the label if present. Morphine in a syrup was still perfectly legal. Morphine you didn't mention was not. A real improvement, and not remotely the same thing as protection. And it didn't cover cosmetics or medical devices at all. Then the courts took a piece out of what was left. In 1911, in United States v. Johnson, the Supreme Court held that the misbranding provisions covered false statements about a drug's identity, not lies about what it could cure. You could sell a bottle of colored water, claim it cured cancer, and be outside the statute. Congress patched it the next year, but only for claims made with intent to defraud esprit, and proving what a man believed about his own tonic turned out to be nearly impossible. Wiley lost the internal fight too. Roosevelt set up a rival board of outside scientists to review the chemistry, and it overruled him on benzoate of soda and on saccharin after Wiley made the mistake of telling Roosevelt, who used it daily on doctor's orders, that it was harmful. In 1912, Harvey Wiley resigned, convinced the law he'd spent 30 years building was being administered into meaninglessness. He went to run the testing laboratory at Good Housekeeping. Think about that. The man who created federal food safety in America finished his working life at a women's magazine because a magazine would let him say what the government wouldn't. His bureau was renamed the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration in 1927 and shortened to the Food and Drug Administration in 1930. The agency in this video's title doesn't get its name until 24 years after the law that supposedly created it. It would take another mass death to finish the job, and this time almost all the victims were children. In 1937, the S.E. Massengill Company had a purely commercial problem. Sulfanilamide was a genuinely effective antibiotic, one of the first drugs that actually cured bacterial infections, but it sold in tablets, and children won't swallow tablets. Sulfanilamide doesn't dissolve in water or alcohol. Their chief chemist, Harold Watkins, found something it did dissolve in, diethylene glycol. He added raspberry flavoring. The company checked it for appearance, flavor, and fragrance, shipped it nationwide, and called it elixir sulfanilamide. Diethylene glycol is closely related to antifreeze. It causes kidney failure. Nobody tested it for toxicity, because in 1937 there was no law on Earth requiring anyone to. Roughly 107 people died, a large share of them children being treated for sore throats. FDA inspectors, essentially the entire field force D, were sent across the country to chase down every bottle, and the only legal hook they had was that the word elixir implied alcohol, and there wasn't any. They were prosecuting a labeling technicality while people died. Congress had been sitting on a revision of the 1906 Act for 5 years. The bill passed the following June. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 is where the modern FDA actually begins. For the first time, a manufacturer had to demonstrate a new drug was safe before it went on sale. It brought cosmetics and devices under federal authority. The central principle of modern drug regulation, prove it first, was purchased with about 107 lives, 32 years after 1906, and then it happened one more time. In the late 1950s, a sedative called thalidomide was marketed across Europe and widely prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness. It caused catastrophic birth defects in thousands of children. The United States was largely spared because of one person. Frances Oldham Kelsey, an FDA medical officer new in the job, was handed the application as a routine assignment. She decided the safety data was inadequate and refused to approve it. The manufacturer went over her head repeatedly for more than a year. She kept refusing. Then the European reports arrived. The near miss produced the Kefauver-Harris Amendments of 1962, the second pillar of the modern system. Manufacturers now had to prove a drug was effective, not merely that it wouldn't kill you. Now look at the dates. 1906, after a novel. 1938, after 107 funerals. 1962, after a continent full of injured children, and only because one civil servant was stubborn. Not one of those laws was passed in anticipation of a disaster. Every single one was passed standing in the wreckage of one. Before I close, I owe you the other side, because a story this clean should make you suspicious. The world before 1906 was not a lawless wasteland. State boards of health did real work. Herdy's Indiana board is the proof. Cities employed inspectors. And the national brand was itself a consumer protection technology. A company with a name on the tin had something to lose that an anonymous barrel never did. Some of the most vigorous supporters of a federal standard were firms who wanted a floor their competitors couldn't undercut. Some of the panic was overstated too. Wiley was wrong about benzoates and wrong about saccharin. The whole argument was always about dose, and he sometimes forgot his own principle when he was winning. And the modern critique deserves full strength. Pre-market approval costs years and well over $1 billion per approved drug, and that cost is not abstract. People die waiting for treatments that would have worked. A regulator who approves a harmful drug is publicly destroyed. A regulator who delays a good one is never blamed for the funerals because nobody can name them. That asymmetry has a body count too, just an invisible one. I won't tell you where the line should be. There's no honest way to do that in the last 2 minutes of a video. But here's what this history actually says. Every regulation you find irritating is an answer to a question somebody once had to ask with their own body. The ingredient panel on the carton exists because a doctor in Indianapolis counted dead infants and couldn't find a law. Safety testing exists because a chemist dissolved a good drug in the wrong solvent and never thought to check. The expiry date exists because milk used to be embalmed. So the real question isn't whether we're overregulated or underregulated. It's older and worse than that. Does a society have to bury people in order to learn something, or can it ever once learn first? In 120 years of this, we have not managed it yet. Every line in that law was written after the funeral. John Herdy died in 1925, having spent 30 years fighting for the thing he couldn't find in 1900, a law he could point to. He got one eventually. It took a novel, a poison squad, 107 bodies in 1937, and a stubborn woman in a Maryland office in 1961. And the agency that grew out of it now oversees products accounting for something on the order of 20 cents of every dollar American consumers spend. He wanted a law. What he got was a federal agency with police powers and a budget in the billions. And it still took 2 more disasters after his death to finish building it. Every rule in it is a headstone. If this changed how you look at the label on the back of a carton, subscribe. This channel goes deep on the invisible systems that decide what's allowed to reach you before you ever get a say in it. And there's another one coming that pulls on exactly this thread.